dollar trade deficit. When you look at the trade deficit that we have with certain countries, way over $1 billion per country. But with China, it's $1 trillion. And we have to solve our trade deficit with China. We have $1 trillion trade deficit with China. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year we lose with China. And unless we solve that problem, I'm not going to make a deal. Now, I'm willing to deal with China, but they have to solve their surplus. We have a tremendous deficit problem with China. They have a surplus of at least $1 trillion a year. I think it's like $1.1 trillion. And I want that solved.
We want that solved. President Trump wants the problem solved. So we're going into a trade war, not just with China, but with virtually the entire world, friend, foe, and neutral alike. We have levied just massive tariffs across almost every country in the world, oddly enough, except Russia. We might talk about that in a minute. But to try to make some sense out of this, we have retired British Commodore Steve Jeremy, who we've had on the show many times, big fan favorite here, really eager to have you back on. And first of all, just welcome back to the show, Steve.
Yeah, no, very good to be back, Danny, especially in the light of all that's going on in the trade wars as opposed to the other wars that you and I have been talking about.
Yeah, and there are some commonalities in whatever kind of war you want to talk about, and as it usually works out, there's two sides to this. And so far, most in the United States and certainly in Trump's comments, as we just had there, seem to indicate that it's basically a one-sided deal that we can just issue terms. First of all, just let me ask you, just on the concept of a trade war, and for Trump to want to solve this trade imbalance, which has existed with the U.S. and China for quite a long time, do you think that this tariff war is going to solve that problem?
That's a very good question. I'm not sure that it will, but I'm not sure that it won't. I did spend time when I was in the Navy, believe it or not. I had a year at Cambridge doing international relations and international economics. So I did study it a long time ago. So I don't profess to be an expert, Danny, but I do follow it, and I'm interested in the economic side of it. Well, I think the issue, in a way, is I think it's not just about the trade wars, but also about re-industrializing America, which I suspect is one of the key motivations behind that. And in one way, I'm very supportive of re-industrialization. I'm afraid that we in the West have, because of what's known as the Chicago School of Economists, have deindustrialized. We've essentially sent all our industrial capability overseas because it was cheaper to construct things in China and Vietnam and places like that. And I think that was a mistake looking back. It was a foreseeable mistake in many ways. Will the trade wars solve it? I'm not 100% sure. I mean, I'm watching with interest. And the thing that the trade wars worry me about, or the tariffs worry me about, is that we have a global economy which is, in my view, on the edge of a recession, and it could indeed be a very deep one. I'm not the only one who's saying this. I follow many people who do, and a good American that I follow is a guy called Jeff Snyder, who's an expert in the Eurodollar system, which is a offshore banking system in a way. That's sort of too simplistic to cover it like that. But the danger is that the sanctions and the consequences that they're having, the trade wars and the consequences that they're having on markets could trigger a market crash, and indeed that could have fairly substantial international effects. Whether it would be as bad as 2007, 2008, it wouldn't surprise me. But there again, I've been watching the markets today, and certainly on this side of the pond, they've been down a bit, but they've sort of stabilized. People are running for safety. They're running for bonds and for cash, and so I'd expected that. But what I'm not sure is whether there will be a long-term consequence. I do expect at some stage there to be a significant recalibration, because I just can't think that we can keep printing money the way that we are, and it will have no effects. I mean, all of our major countries, you and the British, the Americans and the British, everybody in Europe, with the exception of the Germans, have major high debt to GDP ratios, well in excess of 100%, which is a significant challenge for these countries. In a way,
that's one of the things I wanted to talk. You mentioned about the the potential of a global economic recession, a deep one. The fact that this is coming on the heels of when, even without a trade war, there was lots of signals and signs that we were already in a weakened economic situation, not the least of which is because of 3 years of supporting the Ukraine war, with all that money going out into a zero-sum situation that only helped the defense sector. I'm sure that was probably a factor as well. But regardless, all the things that are going on, it was already weakened. Throwing in a shock like this seems like it could move it in the wrong direction. But there are those who, as Steve Miller here did on US TV yesterday, seems to think this will actually help.
Under President Trump, for the first time since the rise of China, we are protecting and defending our jobs and our manufacturing base. And we are preventing foreign countries from making it impossible to defend ourselves in the event of a national emergency. Manufacturing security is national security. And he is taking on the rogue bureaucracy and the rogue judiciary that have sapped and stolen and frittered away the rights of our people and pushed them into the hands of unelected power centers. He is, in every sense of the word, restoring national democracy and popular sovereignty. He is making America free again, Mark.
Now, I want to look at some of the fundamentals that he's talking about there, that this is going to bring freedom to the United States and it's going to address these trade imbalances. I wonder if you could help some of our audience understand even the issue of the trade imbalance that Trump also mentioned in that opening section there, because he said it was like $1 trillion. But that some have the opinion that if it's not an equal, a normal balance, that's somehow, necessarily wrong, that an imbalance works against your favor here. But I wonder if you could talk, because I understand there are really pros and cons about having a trade imbalance with different countries.
I mean, one of the issues here, Danny, is that the trade imbalance it's a difficult thing if you're, or it's almost a sort of contradictory thing if you actually have the reserve currency, which America does. So I think America's had a trade imbalance, for example, with China for many years now. And that's in part because you actually have the reserve currency. But I think, to my mind, the what Steve Miller was saying there was right in terms of what the objective is, but whether or not this is the right way to correct it is an open question, because the objective is the re-industrialization of America, and it's an objective which I would support. Whether or not this is trade tariffs are the right way to do it, I think we're going to see, and it's a very, very difficult to guess which way it will go. But so that we really understand how we've got to this situation. This situation started as far back in the 1980s. And in the 1980s, in part, I think because of things like the Falklands War and the arrival of which substantiated Margaret Thatcher in Britain. At the same time that Ronald Reagan was going very much from market-led economic thinking from the Chicago School of Economists. What essentially that meant was that everything was left to the market. And so, of course, what did big corporates do? Well, they actually looked at where they could do things most cheaply. And if it wasn't in this country, well, they went abroad. And they went abroad without really being worried about what it would do to the country. The reason that I think this worked is not that things were cheap abroad, but because of fuel was cheap. So until around about the turn of the century, then we could ship things around the world very cheaply. But we are now at a position which, in my view, is close to or at peak oil. So we're moving from a situation where we had cheap, plentiful and high quality oil to one where we've got scarce, expensive and lower quality oil. And what that means is that it's going to become more and more difficult to ship things around the world. Globalization, I think, was always going to peak for this reason. But I think what will be interesting will be if this particular set of tariff wars actually prompts this more quickly. And that is an open question. I mean, I watch with as much interest, but not much more forecasting success than anybody else, I think.
And one of the challenges with making this work, because I certainly do understand the concept that President Trump is trying to get at here, where he wants to bring in, and he's been talking about this for many years, to bring industrial capacity back to the United States. Because as Miller said there, it's national security, because if your industrial capacity is overseas and something happens somewhere, it could get shut off in a moment, et cetera. So again, I agree with you that that's a good objective. The question is this going to solve the problem? And as I mentioned in the outset of this, one of the problems when you get into any kind of war is that there are two sides, and they have two different, I guess, not just perspectives, but economic interest in how things work out. So if you can find a win-win situation, great. But if you're having a situation where I want to win, and if you lose, I don't really care, it's not going to have a good outcome. Here already is the first. This is analyst Brendan Murray talking about that China is already doing some retaliation.
We heard President Trump many times say that trade wars are good and easy to win. And I think what we're seeing from the financial markets perspective is trade wars are hard and they aren't easy to win. China, as Alan mentioned, hit back at those rare earth minerals. That will really hurt American companies that are making batteries and high-tech medical devices. That will really leave a mark on the innovative side of the economy. And we'll have to see what Europe does now. Does Europe throw fuel on the fire? Or do they let this burn it on its own?
Well, that's a big question there. But I mean, some of the responses from China already is a 34% increase in what's going on as a tit for tat, because that's what we had increased on their side. But some of those are pretty important, like the rare earths. So how do you see this unfolding with who's going to blink first?
Yeah, good question. I mean, take a long time before we work, or take a bit of time before we work out how quick will be the impact of those commodities, the rare earth commodity. There are other bits and pieces of this as well. I mean, from memory, the Russians are major providers of uranium to America, and I think that the problem that Trump no doubt faces is that the objective of reindustrialization is a good one, but it takes time. So for now, much of the industrial capacity that we use to run Western economies is actually in the Far East. So if we, through trade wars, we shut off those economies, then of course what we're doing is reducing our own effective economic capacity. Not least of all because, of course, out in the Far East, there are growing markets. So it's not as if that America is the only market that China can sell its goods into.
Well, and Gary, if you could put that back up there, Gary just found this while we're on the air here. In terms of China's comment about the 34%, Trump says if China does not withdraw its 34% increase above their long-term trading abuses by tomorrow, April 8th, the United States will impose additional tariffs on China of 50%. This doesn't seem to be going in a good direction of trying to find an amicable way to move out of this. What do you expect that the Chinese would do if he does up it to 50%?
I don't know what your guess is. Your guess is probably as good as mine, but my guess is that they'll match him. And then where do you go from there? I mean, the problem is that this is a fundamental issue which has happened over the course of 30 or so years. And in many, I think it was back as far as Nixon and Kissinger, where actually they felt that the opening up of China to Western markets and the Western system would be a good thing, and that it would eventually lead to democracy. It didn't. But what it did lead to is an extraordinary industrial growth, so much so that that China is now the industrial powerhouse of the world, as America was in the 20th century and Britain was in the 19th century. When you look just at the shipping and what China's doing in shipping, it is absolutely extraordinary what they're doing. China does have a weakness, and this weakness is that it's a major oil importer, which America is not. But again, I don't think that matters on this particular one. China does have a very good relationship, thanks to the West, with Russia. We've now pushed the two together, and of course, Russia
and
is
Iran, add that to it.
Major energy exporter. I've always felt that one of the reasons for them wanting to be close to each other was exactly that reason. Russia wants to sell its oil and gas, of which it's the world's second largest oil exporter from memory and the second largest gas exporter. When you put the two together, Russia's the largest exporter, and of course China's one of the largest importers.
And then, you add in there the Iran, who's also sending a lot of its fuel because of our sanctions also into both India and China. And then you have this issue because those are also BRICS members. And that's kind of where I wanted to ask you next. What is the risk that we overplay our hand here, and the clear advantages that we do have in any kind of a trade war and the capabilities, but that it could actually, just like you just mentioned there about how some of our previous actions have pushed Russia and China and Iran and North Korea closer together, that's on a military basis, but maybe even an economic basis with the BRICS, that this could compel more people to say, America is a dangerous partner here. We need to be moving away from the dollar and away from the U.S. How much of a risk is there of that?
I mean, that risk has already come to the fore even before this time. I think the last time that China was a net buyer of treasuries, American treasuries, was in 2013. And in the past, what China would do would be to sell goods into America, and then with the dollars that it received, it would buy American treasuries, which would in turn finance the American debt. What it's now doing, as far as we can see, is buying gold instead, which in part explains why gold has been going up. It's not the only reason, but I think that's one of the primary reasons. So again, I think there's some very thin ice around here. I'm just not sure whether Donald Trump's skating on it or not. But the big thing is, as I say, is whether or not this is going to trigger a global recession. As I say, I have been expecting a global recession. And the reason I've been expecting it is the close correlation between GDP and energy. It's generally speaking, people don't realize that there's an extremely close correlation between a country and indeed the world's GDP and the amount of energy the world uses. And people generally think it's to do with the economics, but it's actually to do with energy. So as the energy supplies start to go down, then I expect the GDP to go down, which essentially is another way of describing a recession or indeed a depression. So I've been expecting a recession, and an extended one for some time. The question is whether or not this event will actually trigger it. And I don't know, but I'm watching closely.
Yeah, it's hard for me to imagine it doing the opposite, but like you say, we'll have to wait and see how that works out. But you mentioned earlier in this episode about some of the markets in Europe and elsewhere were reeling, at least initially, in the trading today. Here is actually a report from Sky News that talks about just how deep some of that may be.
Confirmation from Hong Kong that its stock exchange has closed down more than 13% today, that it's its worst single day in 30 years, since 1997 in the financial crash back in Asia back then. Now, Asia is more exposed simply because it trades a lot more with the United States and the reaction to China. But we've seen, for example, particularly in Hong Kong, big global banks that are involved in global trade, like HSBC, get really hammered today, and Standard Chartered as well, simply because they will be impacted by these tariffs most. And it's the same when it comes to car manufacturers, for example. One of the big fallers in India today has been Tata, which makes a lot of cars that are exported to the United States. It is a similar story in Europe. It is those companies, again, that are most exposed and trade most with the United States that are really, really finding this difficult.
Now that at the top of that report there, that really kind of surprised me a little, that the Hong Kong's market fell by the highest in 30 years. That is not an auspicious comment, especially when you're talking about the 2007 recession that happened, and this beat that. That's not a good indicator. Yeah.
Again, I'm not an expert on the Far East, although I watch. I think the interesting one on the Far East is China. Because China, it's a closed economy in many ways rather than an open economy. And it does seem to have a property bubble, but it's able to control its economy in a way which is less easier for us. As regards Hong Kong, I'm not sure. I suspect that'll be financial. One of the issues here is one of the ones to watch in terms of shares is banks. Because actually banks, if they're over leveraged and they're over exposed, then they don't do well in stock market crashes. I'm not sure this is a crash yet, but it reminds me of the 2007-2008 crash. I remember that well. I was in Houston at the time on a Royal College of Defence Studies visit and watching the markets go down was astonishing. I'm looking now at the Google's price reductions, and they're sort of roughly around that, the 4 to 5%, which is a big figure today, and on top of that previously. But they did stabilize a bit, so that was pretty much the same as it was this morning, Danny. So I suspect that they're stabilizing a bit. I imagine that people are actually sort of having made their initial corrections and got more into cash and got rid of the leverage positions, that they're actually now just taking a breath and just seeing which way this is going. So Hong Kong, I suspect it's finance. Hong Kong, big financial center still. HSBC, of course, are there.
And I think one of the, I guess, indicators that we should be watching for next is what is the reaction? Okay, so Trump made the first big play, and that's what caused the markets to tank and drop down for all the reasons you just mentioned here. And then I think the next round is going to be see what happens next. What is the reaction? What kind of response do these countries have to Trump, and how does that look like it's either going to resolve or deepen the crisis? I just showed you the retaliation potential from that China's already done, and now Trump's got a threat against that. But it's not just the Asia, it's also Europe, as Ursula von der Leyen just laid out a mark that she's got some, or the European Union has some retaliation on their minds.
This is why from the outset, we have always been ready to negotiate with the United States to remove the remaining barriers to transatlantic trade. At the same time, we are prepared to respond. We are already finalizing the first package of countermeasures in response to tariffs on steel, and we're now preparing for further countermeasures to protect our interests and our businesses if negotiations fail.
Now, I think it's a lot easier for China to be brash and brash. European Union has and the NATO and many European countries have been a lot less hesitant, or a lot more hesitant to take any action counter to the United States. But if this gets push comes to shove, do you think that the European Union is going to actually push something back hard on what the Trump is talking to do here?
I do think it's possible. In fact, I think it's likely. Again, there's a guess, Gary, Danny. But I do think it's possible. Whether that's a good idea is a different question, because the European Union is not in good shape economically, with one or two exceptions. The one to watch is Germany, and of course the European Union and Germany in particular is in bad shape because of the Russia-Ukraine war. They blame it on Putin, but actually the reason that they're in bad shape is that we've collectively imposed sanctions on Russian oil and gas, which was, as I've said before, a boomerang sanction. And it's come back in exactly the way that I certainly forecast back in 2022. It's a liquid global market, oil and gas, so sanctioning is going to make no difference other than to make your own imports more expensive. So we've replaced, or the Europeans have replaced relatively cheap Russian gas with expensive LNG. Now, Germany, I think, is in recession. Britain and France, I think, are on or close to recession. I think Britain grew about 0.1%. But when you look through into and look at it through an energy lens, which is what I do, I would say both of those countries are in recession, and Germany possibly even more. So it's not a good place to actually enter into a trade war.
Well, and that's actually what I wanted to go into, because in terms of, the U.S. wanting to have a negotiating position, we want this tariffs to go on so that you'll negotiate something better. These kind of deals are zero sum on the target countries. So whatever the status quo has been with the trade and the imbalances and so forth, that means that Europe, and like you just said, Britain, France, Germany, et cetera, they either are or are about to be into a recession or something real close to it, which means they're not in good shape. Can they now then negotiate a position worse for them, which will exacerbate their own domestic situations, because Trump wants something better for the U.S.? What room does the European, and we'll look at UK in particular, do they have to negotiate something in a U.S. advantage?
Well, I'd say that they can make things worse, because they've been very good at it so far. I mean, the sanctions it was obvious that the sanction on Russia would have a negative impact on Europe. It was absolutely obvious. I can't understand how anybody couldn't see it. And yet, of course, it's one thing putting sanctions on Russia and then blaming it on Putin, but actually it was a collective decision by the Europeans to do it. They're also doing a second thing, which I think is going to have a bad effect on their economies, and which is to do with the war, which is that they've decided to believe their own political narrative that Putin is coming west, and so they're starting to rearm. What that means is that they're putting money from capital investment into defense industries. And I'm not against defense industries as a sailor, as I'm sure you would be as a soldier.
Indeed.
But with a limit. And, and if we're going to get up to the GDP ratios that we did with defense in the middle of the Cold War, we were up at 6% here, and we're about 2.1% in Britain. So we'd be talking about a doubling at least of defense expenditure, and that money would have to come from somewhere else. And so when it comes from somewhere else, then that's your second blow on your own economy, because defense expenditure, although it shows up in GDP, as a contributor to GDP. In terms of capital expenditure, it does nothing in terms of improving the productivity of your
right.
economy, industrial productivity. So, and yeah, could the Europeans follow that second body blow with the third one? I think they probably could, because I don't really see huge amounts of geopolitical competence in the current European Union leadership.
Well, that's not an encouraging sign if they're not showing that kind of confidence, because, I mean, they may agree to a third body blow, but at some point that stuff has an implication and an outcome of its own, no matter what any policymaker wants. And that could be bad for the British economy as well. I mean, on top of everything else.
Yeah, possibly could. I mean, we're out of Europe, of course, and I think that's allowed us to tread a different path. Now, when the Russia-Ukraine war started, I felt that it would have a deleterious effect on NATO. I still do as well. I think NATO is quite how long it lasts, but NATO without America would not long last. But I also have been increasingly feeling, watching the European Union or the leadership of the European Union operate, that it would be the same for the European Union as well. And I'm increasingly of that view. We've had one body blow already. If we've got a second and a third, then as soon as the European Union starts to get into economic and financial trouble, then the glue that has held it together, which is largely speaking the money that's been available from the northern richer states, centered with Germany, if that's no longer available, then actually there's much less logic for other European players to stay in. And I'm starting to see quite a few differences of opinion, and strong differences of opinion, not just with Hungary, of course, and Orban, but also other states such as Spain and
Italy. Right.
We're starting to feel to me as if they're on a divergent path, which could lead to the end of the European Union. I always forecast that it would collapse, because the European Union has a situation where it's got it's a union, and it has a common fiscal policy which it tries to impose, so in terms of how it taxes, but no supranational body that's in charge. So that would always lead to problems. And you also have major imbalances as a result of the euro and how that works. They're called target 2 imbalances between payments between the southern states in Europe and the northern states in Europe, which at the moment, I think Germany's owed about 1.3 trillion euros from the southern states, which to me looks unpayable. So I always suspected that it would come apart. But it might well be that that this is another nail in that particular coffin, if I'm right.
Wow. Yeah, we'll certainly keep an eye on that too. All the news isn't necessarily bad, at least from the U.S. side. This report here from Maria Martiromo, who's a financial expert at Fox Business News, was on Fox News earlier today and was asked about how some of this stuff is going. She has some concerns, but there's a couple of areas that she said, at least right now, seem to be going in a good direction.
I will say that there were some signals over the weekend that we could see some signs of de-escalation, because the White House said that 50 countries have contacted them to renegotiate tariffs lower. The president is going to have a press conference today with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu from Israel. We will likely hear a conversation about tariffs. Perhaps they will cut tariffs there. That could be a good market-moving sign. You had some good positive comments from the Prime Minister of the UK saying we don't love what Trump is doing, but we understand. And there is a room for renegotiation there as well. And I just want to point out some positives here, because while you have the stock market selling off, oil prices are down and interest rates are down. These are two very good signs, and that will help the consumer and certainly rein in inflation.
You'd mentioned specifically the cost of energy, and at least in the initial reaction, my understanding, if I understand how the systems work, is that when you have suppressed economic output, then you also have a lowering of the oil cost. Because of the requirement for it goes down as well. But is that a temporary situation, or might that help the situation?
Well, again, she's positive both the oil prices and interest rates going down as a positive, whereas I'm not sure that it is a positive. Oil prices going down is because the markets are assuming that we're going to tip into a recession. That's why they're going down, and so there will not be so much demand for oil. And as regards the interest rates, well, that's due to people getting out of equities and into bonds. And as they get the way that bonds work, as you buy bonds, then actually that reduces the cost of interest, which, fun enough, does help us a little. But the reason that it's going down is not to help us. So the reason it's going down is people are running for safety. And government bonds, especially American Treasury bonds, are always seen as a safe haven in difficult times. So that's why the interest rates are going down, Gary. Again, the issue really is whether that recession does really deepen, or whether through, let's imagine that through negotiations, and you often wonder with Donald Trump whether this is part of his loud negotiations, after which there's a bit of making up, and then we get into a sort of slightly more stable situation. I don't know. I suspect that. But
we can certainly hope it. But one last little comment here I want to show from the Singaporean Prime Minister. Doesn't seem to be as confident as you.
The WTO system brought unprecedented stability and prosperity to the world and to the U.S. itself. To be clear, the system is not perfect. Singapore and many others have long called for reform to update the rules and to make the system better. But what the U.S. is doing now is not reform. It is abandoning the entire system it had created. The last time the world experienced something like this was the 1930s. Trade wars escalated into armed conflict, and eventually
the Second World War. And that, the past is sometimes prologue to the future. It's not a requirement. It's not, well, if something happened in the past, like I'm all the time talking about people who just say, like, every situation is 1938 and everybody is Hitler that rises up. And a lot of those comparisons are very poor. This one, though, sounds a little bit more concerning. And I wonder what you're thinking, not just in the individual nations, but kind of in a geopolitical environment altogether. Do you have concerns that economic situations could actually lead to global conflict?
Yes, I think I do. Although whether it's global conflict or whether it's actually conflict within nations is an open question. I'm a bit boring, I'm afraid, on energy. But if you look at the most recent internal conflicts, you'll find that a lot of them are due to high energy costs. As far back as 2012, I think it was 2012, the Arab Spring, when people talked about that, people often said that it was a breakout of democracy. I don't think it was. I think it was actually a economic hardship. It was broke out in Tunisia, and the man who set fire to himself, which resulted in this great explosion of civil war, essentially, in Tunisia, was actually unable to feed his family. And I remember talking to my brother at about the same time. My brother's an Arabic specialist, and he was talking to people Egypt, and one of the persons he talked to in Egypt gave him an Arabic phrase, which, when translated, said the people are unable to feed themselves. And I think what we're seeing is that as the energy supplies start to become more expensive, then that starts to play out in quite complex ways across the world. I mean, Sri Lanka, another place where they actually had significant problems within their own societies. And so it's also worth thinking that during the 2007 and 2008 economic crisis, that here in Europe, it was the pigs, that's Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain, who really struggled. All of those countries are major net importers of oil without much of their own energy supplies. So I think these things are complexly related. Where I could imagine wars being caused. I think an interesting one is in the Americas. At the moment, the United States is a net importer of oil. So you refine a lot of oil, but actually you need to import heavier oils to match the light ones that you produce in the States. I think you import around about $2 million barrels a day. It's that sort of figure. But as that becomes more difficult, because of course what will happen with the reducing in oil supplies is that will make the shale fields, the Permian and other fields less commercially attractive, which could in turn reduce America's own oil supplies. I could imagine in the future America looking across at Venezuela, which still has major oil supplies in the world, albeit not being very, very well produced. But I can certainly imagine a significant conflict there, as perhaps America looks at them more closely or wants to get its own companies involved. Here across in Europe, I'm not sure. I think much of the strife is more likely to be internal, as the economies start to struggle, and when economies struggle, then civil strife breaks out. The curious thing will be Russia. I think Russia is going to sail through this with few problems, because of course it's got its own energy supplies, and also it's a major got its own industrial capacity as well. The other curious one is China, because China, as I say, is a major oil importer and a major energy importer, and also there are signs the strong signs of a major property bubble in China. But it's easier for the Chinese to manage their economy because it's a closed economy, unlike ours.
And one of the things that worries me specifically about China is that, to the Singapore Prime Minister's point, one of the causes of World War II, especially in the Pacific, was the U.S. oil embargo on China and the blockade that Japan that we had blocked. And that put them in a position where they calculated that their existence was at threat in the future if they didn't take some action now. And I worry about, even though the factors are different, conceptually there's some similarities. If we put too much problems in and trying to crimp things on the Chinese, that they may not come to a similar conclusions with whatever the circumstances may be there. I'm not trying to draw direct parallels, but there are some uncomfortable similarities, I would say.
Yeah, what do they say? They say history rhymes, isn't it? And I think that I can see that one there. I think that it would be in America's interest to achieve some sort of accommodation with China, not only on tariffs but more generally. I think I've always thought that Taiwan, which has been this difficult issue, is one which America's in a no-win situation, because militarily I think it's indefensible. Certainly, as I look back to the Falklands War, we had to mobilize virtually the whole country against a second-rank power. But the problem was the distance, and working at 8,000 miles from the Falklands, it was a very close-run thing. With America, you're looking at a major power right next to Taiwan. So, to my mind, it's indefensible. So
right. The Falklands weren't near as capable with their anti-defense as the Chinese are. So, even more worry for us.
I think they've actually now got more ships in their navy than the Americans have, which is just amazing how much they're producing. Not as many aircraft carriers, but more ships. Of course, their submarines still won't be as capable, I'm sure, but actually the rate at which they're producing. But they do have this critical vulnerability, which is energy supplies, and it's one which I'm sure that they're acutely aware of. What was very interesting, I saw an analysis about a year ago, which when the Chinese watched the Americans go into Iraq, one of the key deductions for them was that this was about oil. And it made the Chinese think differently about how they interacted with America, and they started buying less treasury bonds at that stage. And I think it was around about 2011 or 2013 when they became no longer net purchasers of treasury bonds. So in other words, they weren't funding the American debt, which they'd done, they had been contributing to until now. And that was their analysis of the Iraq War. I'm not sure whether the analysis was right, but the fact that they were looking as far back as that sort of makes me think that this is top of the pops for them. It's why their relationship with Russia is one that's it's a relationship which, even had it not been for our policy in Russia against Russia, would still probably have happened one way or another.
I've come to the same conclusion, but it was definitely exacerbated by that and sped up. In the last few minutes we have here, I want to shift gears a little bit since I've got you handy here and talking about another developing situation outside of the economic spheres, and that is in the Middle East. There has been a lot of airstrikes by the U.S. against Yemen. There's going to be a meeting later this afternoon between Benjamin Netanyahu and Trump in the White House. We're actually going to be covering that at 3:30 this afternoon, whatever comes out of that. Lots of threats coming from the United States to Iran, and there's a direct connection made by the White House between what's going on in Yemen and in Iran itself. Now, previous to today's news, Trump had said basically we're going to just go on a sustained bombing campaign to teach the Houthis that they can't get away with this, with blocking the Red Sea shipping. So we've been having this sustained air campaign. But then this news from the CNN just hours ago is suggesting that far from being cowed by U.S. airstrikes, the Yemen's Houthis may be relishing them. Does this surprise you at all?
No, the Houthis have held up for years of a campaign against them by the Saudi Arabias, which eventually seemed to finish off as a score draw. And they seem to be well armed, as far as I can see, and with some quite dangerous or some quite effective weapons. And what we've been watching in the Red Sea is that it's not easy, even for a first-rate military power such as America, with the support of some European forces, to actually prevent the Houthis actually closing down the Red Sea. Effectively, they've closed down the Red Sea and use those weapons very effectively. I mean, as a naval aviator, I'm of course interested in how air power is deployed. But actually, I think we're seeing amongst the Houthis that there is a limit to the utility of air power. I mean, it's always been the case in a way. And I look across to Iran and think about the use of air power in Iran. I mean, ultimately, if you want to do something in a country, then you do it with people on the ground, not ships offshore or aircraft above. So that's the only way which you can achieve real change.
Well, now, in fact, and on that regard, also CNN is reporting, literally, I just saw it right before we came on the air here, that apparently the White House is signaling that they're ready to do some things on the ground in Yemen, sending in some American special forces to work with the Yemen government that is recognized by the UN, separate from the Houthis in there. There's been a simmering civil war, as you mentioned, since I think 2015 at least. So they're trying to think about maybe we go in there and do something on the ground. Does that have a chance of success?
My guess is not, but I think what they're talking about is sort of reinforcing the existing regime. I think is what they're saying. I haven't seen the article.
Yeah,
but again, I think the problem here is that the Houthis are doing this because of the events that are playing out in Gaza. They've been absolutely clear. As soon as the ceasefire was in place, they stopped. As soon as the ceasefire broke down, they started again. And that's the reason they're doing it. I think you can have quite a lot of effect by using air power and special forces together. We saw that in in Afghanistan in 2003. It was a terrific use in many ways of air power with special forces. However, what that analysis in 2003 missed was that we were jumping into the middle of what already was a civil war between the Taliban and the Northern Alliance.
Right.
And so bringing overwhelming American air power on the side of the Northern Alliance, of course, they deposed the Taliban. I think without understanding really the proper context, the geographic and geopolitical context within Yemen, I'd be super cautious about this, because I'm not sure. We haven't achieved much so far, indeed, other than use lots and lots of expensive missiles to shoot down quite a few cheap drones, which isn't a good calculation.
Right.
But without doing that proper analysis and really understanding the detail of what's going on, again, I'm sure you and I both, with our experience in Afghanistan, I realized that we were very poor at understanding the geopolitical context and even the tribal context. It took me, I was sitting with a naval captain, fun enough, in ISAF headquarters in Afghanistan, we were sitting around a chart of Afghanistan, and on the one hand we had all the military incidents, on the other hand we also had the patchwork of the Pashtun tribes, and they were completely concurrent. And we suddenly looked at each other and said, this isn't an Afghan insurgency, it's a Pashtun insurgency. And so it was. But you've got to have that level of understanding of the local people and the local culture before you should throw any sort of weapons at it, if you think you're going to do anything other than waste munitions and probably make yourself look even worse on the world stage because of the failure that follows.
Yeah, and I'm seeing play out here a very similar dynamic to what I've witnessed firsthand in Afghanistan, in that we had this big surge of forces going there under Obama, actually two separate surges in 2009, 2010, to where we said, hey, there's a problem militarily, so we'll go in even bigger. And again, we were working with the Afghan security forces with all of our combat power to quell the Taliban. And I'll never forget that I can't remember the exact numbers right now, but it was somewhere around 15 or 20,000 alleged Taliban members at the beginning of the surge. And then after we ended the surge and left, it ended up being around 75,000. So however many we killed in all that time, all it did was draw like a magnet more people to come in. And it appears that same dynamic is playing out right now in Yemen.
Yeah. I remember well when we were prepping to sort of increase the force as NATO took over in Afghanistan in 2006, I think it was. And we were prepping to increase it, and we put quite a large British force into the Helmand province. And at the time we went in, there was an American PRT, about 150 people. Sorry, provincial reconstruction team, about 150 people. And it was pretty quiet. And anyway, put 4,500 British troops in. It got very busy and noisy. And the reason was, I'm sure, was they said, our intelligence said there's only about 200 to 400 Taliban. And afterwards, people say, we obviously got that wrong. But I think they probably didn't get it wrong. I think what happens is by putting people in, large military forces in, the people rose up against us. And surprise, I mean, the Afghans have got a habit of doing that and doing it very well. I mean, the British should know this more than anybody. I think we've had two wars in the century before last where at best it was a score draw, but we worked out that it wasn't a good thing to do. And it feels very similar in the in Yemen, although I don't know that campaign or the tribal makeup nearly as well. But you've got to have a really good understanding of that. As I look back at that, and it's a bit like it might well be the same really with Yemen, was that what we were trying to do in Afghanistan, Danny, was to solve a security problem by changing nations' culture. We're trying to fast forward them into the 21st century with lots of development aid. And best of luck with that. My wife's Zimbabwean, and was brought up in Zimbabwe, which was one of the British colonies, then transferred to its own rule. And when as Robert Mugabe came in, then after that we've seen essentially a reversion to African culture. And surprise, I think when we get into places like this and assume that we can solve problems by military force and development aid and telling people how to run their countries. I think that not only is it hubristic and arrogant, it also doesn't work.
Yeah, it's just
it doesn't work.
ineffective.
We've got
And you know,
five.
I fear that we're about to even get deeper into that problem with Iran, the supporter of the Houthis. You've, like I said a minute ago, had President Trump and Netanyahu going to meet together today. Netanyahu, about a month ago, said that with Trump's help, he is ready to, quote, finish off the Iranians and get that problem solved once and for all. And then, of course, you've had Trump just a number of days or about a week ago say that either the Iranians will make a deal to Trump's satisfaction or there will be bombing, et cetera. And now that here they're meeting today, we don't know what they're going to say, but it just doesn't seem like it's got a good feel that we're going to say, you know what, we'll just negotiate this away. We'll just take the military off the board. What is your best guess of what you think may come out of this meeting?
I'm not sure. I would hope that it's a negotiated solution. In fact, I fervently hope that it's a negotiated solution. It's a pity that the what was it, JPCOA was cancelled all those years back because it was working and it had Russia on board as well. But the fear is that if it's a military solution, the first thing is that without putting troops on the ground, the Americans will not want to put troops on the ground in Iran. Nor can the Israelis. But without putting troops on the ground, you're using strategic bombardment to achieve your aims. I have a strong suspicion that the way that the Iranians will respond to this is by strategic bombardment of Israel. And the difference is that Iran is a very large country and Israel is a very small country. So Israel's a very easy target. And we saw some pretty sophisticated responses from Iran against Israel. And if you recall, I think it was I was listening to Alistair Cook about 9 months ago, where the Israelis kicked off what was going to be a bombing attack against Iran and then stopped because they realized that they didn't understand, no doubt, the signature of the radars they were receiving and the air defense systems that they're up against. So they didn't actually push through with that. What I could imagine happening would be not only strategic bombardment of Israel, doing a lot of damage to Israel, but I could imagine as well that others in the Middle East, other Arab states in the Middle East, starting perhaps with Turkey, saying that, okay, well, this is perhaps a time to stop this for good in Israel and actually be more aggressive with Israel. But Turkey, I think, already putting military forces into Syria. And I could imagine the Egyptians as well, less likely the Egyptians. But if you've got an Israel which has, through the irrational acts of its leader, been doing things which actually weaken it, then I could imagine that it make Israel's situation much weaker rather than stronger. And I would hope that the AIPAC lobby are thinking about that as well. So it did make me wonder that one of the reasons why Netanyahu might have got 17% as opposed to 10% was that actually the Americans are starting to wonder whether or not he is the right leader for Israel and whether they do want to keep backing him or whether they might want somebody more moderate in there. So I don't know. That's just sort of me putting two and two together and making 17 perhaps, but it's just thinking.
Well, we'll certainly see how that works out there. And of course, one of my primary concerns about the military solution, so-called, is that there are 50,000 American troops scattered throughout the Middle East, many of them on small bases in Syria, which don't have strategic air defense capacity, only tactical stuff, which would be absolutely vulnerable to anything that Iran would choose to do. And their IRGC commander has outright threatened that they would do that in the event of a conflict with the United States. So there's everything to lose and every reason to go after diplomacy. And I certainly hope that's what they do.
Yeah, I strongly agree with you, Tony. I think we've got little to gain in this and a lot to lose. You know, we know that Russia are supportive of Iran, not just because of their relationship, but also because Russia has a trade route which runs from Russia down into the Indian Ocean. So Russia is supportive of Iran. And so it seems now quite a few of the other Middle Eastern nations who did not used to be. I mean, Iran, of course, is a Shia, is the leading Shia state in the Middle East, and one of Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Egypt, depending on who you listen to is the leading Sunni. But whilst in the past that the Saudi Arabians and the Iranians were very, very suspicious of each other, they do seem to be closer now as a result of these actions. It's almost impossible really to drive them together. But I'm afraid Netanyahu seems to have done it.
Yeah, it just we've been doing a lot of that. Been under Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, and now all of a sudden he even here. So it's time to start reversing some of those. So I'd love to see some better policies come out. But in any case, we'll keep on watching this, and really appreciate your insights today on both the economic issues as well as this the Middle Eastern situations here. And look forward to having you back on again real soon.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And thank you for all you do, what you and Gary do down here. So it keeps us sane over here.
All right. Thanks a lot. And we'll look forward to seeing you guys. We got a couple of more shows today to let you know about. We got Andrei Martyanov, who's going to be back on because lots of information coming out that Russia has potentially a major new offensive in the plan here. And there's a lot of things going on you may not have been aware of. We're going to bring that on this afternoon. And then, as mentioned earlier, at 3:30 p.m., we'll be covering whatever comes out of this meeting between Netanyahu and the White House, especially a lot of things that have been queued up and teed up here by Commodore Jeremy. We'll see what happens with that. Thanks very much. And we'll see you later this afternoon on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.